So, how do the news media choose their stories? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that the most important stories may require long explanations or technical background, right? Now, sometimes if a story is really important, some news organizations will supply an explainer, but mostly they're reluctant to do this because it drives people away. So, if you compare the banking crisis with the MP's expenses scandal, the banking crisis cost this country's public finances billions. The MP's expenses scandal, their sums ran into tens of thousands. So, roundings, floor sweepings, compared with the cost of the banking crisis. The banking crisis caused a worldwide recession, caused governments to rise and fall, altered the fate of nations. The MP scandal was about a small number of MPs doing some fairly small fiddles. Which one stuck in the public imagination? Well, see, the thing about the banking crisis is it was both foreign and complicated, and also it didn't have an obvious villain. So the banking crisis starts with subprime mortgages in the United States of America. So these are mortgages sold to people who can't really afford a mortgage. And then those debts get sold on, and they get sliced up into little bits and then repackaged into bundles, and the bundles get sold on and traded around the world, finance houses. And the theory was that because the debt was all spread out, that kind of reduced the risk. But of course, all it meant was that the risk was everywhere. And when eventually it all went bad, the whole thing fell over. Whose fault was that? Well, it would be nice, especially if you're telling the story, if your job is to tell the tale on the telly or in print, it would be nice if there was an obvious villain. But what about the people who took out the mortgages? I mean, if you take out a mortgage and can't afford it, aren't the bad consequences your fault? Well, maybe. But, deciding whether or not you can afford a mortgage is something most people need help with. So maybe the agents who sold the mortgages. Well, possibly, but they're acting on instructions from head office. Maybe the people who ran this whole debt spreading, slicing, bundling, reselling thing. Maybe they're the real villains. Well, okay, yes. But there wasn't any one of them. There wasn't one building or one place or one nameable individual. It wasn't like a rogue trader story. Remember Nick Leeson and the other rogue traders? It wasn't that where there was a person you could point at. And besides, isn't this whole mess supposed to be regulated by government? Well, yes. But then blaming the government is a kind of odd thing to do, especially in Britain, because at the time we had a Labour government, a conservative opposition, and saying, there ought to have been laws against all this trading was a rather awkward thing for the party of individual responsibility to do. So they wanted to blame the Labour government, and they, in the end, were quite successful. But it was slightly awkward ideological sell. Anyway, the point for the present moment is that there wasn't a single villain, right? There wasn't a single bad guy with a twirlable moustache. So although it was all immensely expensive and cost millions of people their jobs, because there were lots of people who had nothing to do with finance and mortgages and the banking industry, lost their jobs as a result of the resulting recession. In spite of all that, the news organizations struggled to stay interested, and their attention was kind of drawn away towards the political ramifications. Then, a bit later, along comes the MP's expenses scandal. Now, I mean, you can say, oh well, they're our elected representatives, and so their probity is especially important. Yada yada. There's something in that, but really, it was about people skimming relatively small. I mean, yes, it was a scandal, and yes, it should be reported, and yes, the people who were punished ought to have been punished, and the lessons learned were real lessons that had to be learned, but it shouldn't really have driven the banking scandal off the front pages, because it's a much smaller story. It really didn't matter as much. The most important events worldwide may be remote, expensive to cover, or just boring, right? Developments in technology before they arrive. The Chinese government's Silk Roads program. Basically, it's about trade, the negotiations about trade deals between advanced countries. These are immensely complicated and technical, and really very, very boring. So it's been a problem for I'm not just talking about the EU. I mean, in North American media had to report on the North American Free Trade Area. Very boring, very complicated. Important news, long-term trends may not be newsworthy, right? So the great struggle for environmentalists is to try to turn the slow degradation of the environment into a story. But on most days, the environment just goes on degrading a little bit more. There isn't anything that would attract a film crew, which is why you get people trying to create happenings and events. There's a fine old saying that trying to understand what's going on in the world by reading the newspapers and watching the news is like trying to tell the time by watching the second hand of a clock, right? And finally, we like stories about ourselves, right? We like stories that in some way involve us. So if there's one of the reasons that we're not getting news from Kyrgyzstan is that political events in Kyrgyzstan don't obviously impact our lives. They're not in some indirect way about us. So for all these reasons, coverage of foreign stories tends to decrease, right? And the news becomes more and more insular, with the singular exception of the political life of the United States of America, because it's an English-speaking country that's very large and important, and journalists want to go there, right? It's kind of glamorous. They've all watched The West Wing, and they want to be in it. So, all of these considerations make it very unlikely that the media will help us to do the hard intellectual work required to inhabit a foreign culture. When they investigate foreign cultures, the questions almost always relate to our concerns. So if you think about, they'll either be threats to our lifestyle, so stories about Muslims worldwide will mostly be about Islamic terrorists, even though Islamic terrorists are a tiny, tiny minority of Muslims. They're also a minority of terrorists. But anyway, stories about Muslims are mostly about those Muslims who seem to threaten life here in some way. or as critiques of our lifestyle. So stories about the Inuit, for example. You might do a story about how traditional Inuit life is dying out, in part because the Arctic is getting too warm. But again, ultimately, that's a story about us. That's a story about what wicked people we are, with our international flights and our air conditioning and our high energy lives. And that might be true about us, but it's still a story about us, even if it features the Inuit. Okay, so next I want to make a few remarks about political news management.